Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we are going to compare inequality developments in the EU and the US in the frame of the changing nature of jobs. This episode is produced with the Transatlantic Expert Group on the Future of Work, which is an interdisciplinary group of some 30 knowledgeable and highly qualified experts. The group explores multiple emerging challenges in the area of the future of work by bringing together their respective perspectives from the European Union and the United States. The TEG has been brought together by Bruegel and the German Marshall Fund of the United States with the financial support of the European Union. I'm happy to have as guests for this conversation today István Tóth, who is the director of the Tarki Social Research Institute in Budapest, and Indivar Dutta-Gupta, who is the president and executive director of the Center for Law and Social Policy in Washington, D.C. István, Indivar, welcome to the Sound of Economics.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
I'm delighted to join you, Giuseppe.
And I'm really happy to have perspectives across the Atlantic to be shared today on a topic which is sometimes seen as very different from one side to another because of the different perception of the nature of inequalities and the policies to address them across Europe and the United States. Zooming out and in the general framing of the conversation, labor markets and occupations have gone through profound changes as a result of technological progress, globalisation, and changes to the labor market institutions, among many other factors. And a result in the reduction of labor share in income, while inequality has increased across countries. In some EU countries, the decline in the labor share has slowed and seems to have started to increase earlier than in the United States, while some trends in inequality were less pronounced in the EU than in the US. Some of the issues we will shed light on are the factors that might have contributed to these distributional outcomes, focusing on the role of technology and in particular automation, or the changes brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. But before delving into the issue more in depth, I would like to start with a broader reflection to introduce our listeners to the extent, drivers, and incidents of income distribution compared across the Atlantic. So I would like to start with a sort of game of mirrors, if you allow me, Indivar and István. And tell us, for example, you from the United States, how do you perceive the situation in Europe? And István telling us how does he sees what is going on in the US. Just a really snappy introduction about how this is seen from the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, that's a great and fun question, Giuseppe, when I have an expert who I'm sure will tell me what I have wrong. But I'll say that my sense from the United States is that in Europe, there is considerable variation, but consistently lower income and wealth inequality than in the United States. And in particular, I think some European countries have allowed income inequality to grow in recent years. The United Kingdom comes to mind. Also, to some extent, Italy and Germany. Well, some other countries have pushed back more, including some of the Scandinavian countries and France. We can talk more about why there might be this variation, but that is my sense that the United States stands out. But in Europe, there's considerable variation, but overall much less income inequality within countries.
Thank you. And István?
Thank you. It's really a very interesting question. I'm not an expert of the U.S. income inequalities, but my first impression would say that there are significant differences in at least two respects. One is the composition of inequality. In the U.S., the role of wealth is much larger in defining inequalities than in Europe. That's an important thing. And the second thing is that in the U.S., the range of inequalities was always higher than in Europe. But most recently, in the last 10, 15 years, there has been an increasing emphasis on the top of the tops of the top 1%, which perhaps it's more prevalent than in the US than in the European countries. And of course, I I agree with Indy, what he said, that Europe is very heterogeneous, and it's very difficult to speak of Europe in general because of the country level definition of inequality.
This is all very interesting, and István, my next question was going to go exactly more in depth into what you just said. So perhaps we can zoom in now on the EU side and then on the American side. You just pointed that when it comes to Europe, some comparisons are quite challenging in terms of which levels we might want to take into consideration. So this is a first point of attention that we need to keep in mind. But perhaps within the frame of the broader question, which is what are the main drivers of inequalities according to you in Europe, and that will be giving us a bit of a panoramic view on that situation.
Good and very complex question. I try to be very concise. The first about the comparisons, it's very difficult to tell what exactly do we mean when we speak about Europe. So Europe is a geographical entity containing many more countries than the European Union. The European Union also has internal segments with different levels of integration that could be understood properly in the context of inequalities. Let me tell you a few examples. I mean, once we have the European Union, it's been expanded in various phases in different times in the past 30 years. So there are the new members and the old members having all sorts of differences in their policies towards inequality. And also within the European Union, there is no common fiscal policy. So we can't speak about tax and transfer schemes for the whole European scenery, but we have, country level tax and transfer schemes. Also, the education, health, and labor market policies are at national governments' competencies. The European Union gives some sort of indications or guidelines for the national governments, but it's not fully binding. It's sort of a soft pushing the national governments into certain directions. So it takes much longer time to reach common European social space than what is already the US is over. And there is some sort of common cohesion policy, administered redistribution between countries and regions, with an aim to promote cohesion throughout Europe. However, this has only an indirect and relatively partial effect. The second big thing which makes it different is that the history of Europe. I mean, all these countries have very different traditions of freedom and stability of government and private responsibility for welfare and levels of centralization of government, and that all gives us different phases of inequalities. But on the other hand, this is also a sort of advantage, I would say, because Europe can function as a laboratory for policy. So the different countries experimenting with different policies. The North is doing different than the East or the West, and one can compare the successes and failures, and that can be a good learning exercise for the various countries. And this is exactly what the European Union does during the regular monitoring of the inequality processes, that they evaluate the changes in the various countries, whether it's about policies or the different fragments of the inequalities. Yes.
So just before we go to the United States, if you were to identify, of course, it's very hard in the patchwork of the different geographical configurations, but if you were to simplify a little bit, which are the main drivers of inequality, not across the continent, of course, but at least if we can identify some clusters where certain drivers are more important than others, how would you go on describing those?
I think there is a common structure of drivers across the Atlantic. I mean, obviously, the primary drivers are related to the income generation process, the labor markets, and the interplay between the labor markets and education and the production of skills of people who are participating in the labor market. Of course, it's important what is the innovative capacity of the economies, because it can bring more returns. And also what makes a difference is the phase of education expansion in the various countries. And of course, the tax benefit redistribution is very much different in the various countries, and it has a different role. Now, there are the secondary drivers of inequalities, which relate to the composition of the various countries, the sectoral composition of the economy that shifts over time, especially most recently due to this whole digital revolution in the last 30 years. And but also in another aspects, like the household structure, the aging, the marriage patterns, and the within EU migration that might also affect seriously the level of inequalities. And the third broad group of factors relates to political factors. So the countries differ in labor market regulations, differ in their redistributive policies, the strengths of the leftist parties who are more in favor of redistribution, and of course countries are different in openness and exposure to globalization, which is a very important factor behind inequality. But if you want to take a look at the geographical map of Europe, you would see traditionally lower level of inequalities in the Scandinavian countries, higher level of inequalities in the Mediterranean countries, and somewhere in between the center of Europe. But what is very interesting to follow is that there was a larger group of countries who joined the European Union, the Central and Eastern European countries, something like 30 years ago, and you could see very different paths what they followed. So some of them ended up in the higher league of the inequality rankings in Europe, like the Baltic countries and Romania and Bulgaria. Some of them ended up in the middle range, like Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, and some of them ended up in the very low level of inequality. I mean, the lowest level of inequality in Europe, like Czech Republic or Slovenia, for example. So it's so the story of these countries sheds light on how important history and how important the institutional choices what they made in the last couple of years.
Thank you, István, and this brings me to the question to Indy about the situation in the United States, which at some superficial level might seem more homogeneous, than the European Union, because it seems to be less of a patchwork, even though it's a federal state. But maybe I might be wrong, and you might challenge this common view that people might see the United States as a monolith, because probably it's far from being such a monolith, right?
That's right, Giuseppe. And I'll just pick up briefly on the point that István made about laboratories in the EU. In the United States, we have 50 states plus the District of Columbia and some territories. And in fact, over the last 40 plus years or so, we've seen even a pulling apart geographically within the United States. For example, if you look at measures of average family incomes as a percentage of the national average income in the United States in sort of labor markets, commuting areas, you see greater disparities with only a few areas in the United States where families have above average incomes when you look at the overall average for the country. And those are essentially dense urban areas, and specifically around some cities on the coasts and a couple of large cities in what we call the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains. So you're looking at places like Silicon Valley in San Francisco, where the average incomes dwarf those incomes of much of the rest of the country, the New York City to Washington, D.C. area in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast as well, but also places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, Chicago. And here and there are some exceptions in North Dakota, partly because of natural resources and various new industries that sometimes step in. But we have substantial inequality even within the United States. And the federal system devolves substantial authority power to states and localities in many instances as well. So yes, we are very unequal geographically as well.
And going into the drivers of these inequalities across these spectrums of the geography of the country?
Well, Giuseppe, I couldn't help but smile a little bit when you had that fun mirror exercise, because there's another sort of mirror exercise we can do in the United States where you can draw almost a perfect line of symmetry with two trend lines over the last 50 years or so. One is the rate of unionization, which has particularly declined in the last few decades. And the other is the income share of the top 10%, which has shot up, especially in the past few decades. And they almost look like a perfect mirror image of each other. So I think that the power of workers in the United States, as proxied by the decline of unionization, is part of what's driving income inequalities growth, if not the single largest factor. We've also, and these are probably related, not raised our national minimum wage in over 15 years. At least we haven't enacted an increase, and our last increase was 2009, which is kind of astonishing, and the longest stretch we've gone in the United States since we established the minimum wage early in the last century without increasing it. We have some evidence from the 1970s until maybe around 2000. There might have been some skill-related increases to income inequality, but the evidence since 2000 or so suggests that at least technological and educational sort of skills and attainment don't really explain much, if any, of what's going on. And there's certainly been a sort of mating, as it's called, where increasingly people who are likely to earn a lot in the labor market marry other people who are likely to earn a lot in the labor market. But none of that really explains as much as I think the overall sort of reduction in labor market institutions and power for workers in the United States. Finally, I'll just note that while there are a number of other contributors, István noted correctly that we have a particular problem with capital income being very concentrated toward those with the highest income. So when you look at the top 10, especially 0.1% of people in the income distribution in the United States, you find that their share of income that comes from labor income has declined dramatically over the last half century or so. Some of that is just about essentially tax avoidance and booking income a certain way to limit taxes due to preferential treatment, often on capital income and wealth. But nevertheless, that's a particular problem here.
I mean, what you're saying obviously brings me to a second block of questions, which is relating to the past few years and things that have been going on and how they might have changed or accelerated certain trends. So obviously the first thing that comes to our mind, and here I'm speaking about both the US and Europe, of course, one of the first things that comes to my mind is the COVID-19 pandemic and the changes that it has brought in general to the economy, but also specifically when it comes to the job market, the way of work, very linked to as well the second element, which has been the introduction of technology. I mean, you mentioned it that in your case you're not seeing that much of an impact, but perhaps it's interesting to get a little bit more deep into that specific aspect. So yeah, you like technology covered, but also more in the longer term, what has been going on since the financial crisis. Are those changes somehow making a certain break through the future prospects of inequalities, and how in fact very much, I mean, if I can rephrase the question to both of you, how can this technological change and this changing nature of job is impacting on the nature of inequalities and the actual distribution of inequalities? I don't know who would like to start if we want to go back to the European side of the Atlantic in that case, and then we go back to the States.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a very interesting and also very, very complex question. Let me break it into three parts. The first is the effect of the various crises. So it's very interesting to follow that first, there are different phases of the crisis that may affect different parts of the distribution. So if we refer back to the great financial crisis of the 2007-2008, in the first phase, it affected the finances and banking, and it affected the savings of not the poorest, but those who had the savings, the richest. And then came the real production crisis in the real economy, which affected the employed people, then with the increase of unemployment, and of course the poverty risk of active age families has increased. And then came the third phase of the crisis, where the austerity came, and the austerity, because of the problems with the public budgets, then it affected the social systems and affected the poorest people. And they finally, at the end of it, the final result came out from this complex of factors after the great financial crisis. Now, as far as the COVID is concerned, I mean, this is the second biggest topic. Again, the COVID is different in a sense that there has been the health effects and the differential effects of, mortality by age, by social class, and by education because of various factors. Both the infection probabilities and the mortality was differential across various social groups. But also the lockdowns had different effects on those sectors which had a stronger and more conventional labor market composition, and those who were more teleworkable in a sense that they were able to work even during or operate even during the lockdowns. And of course, by gender and age, there has been differential effects, depending on which sectors were dominated, what composition of the labor force. What I would like to, however, emphasize is a more long-term effect, because in many of these sectors, there was quite a quick recovery, I would say, after that. If there would be no war now, then many of these effects would already have been evaporated. But there were significant effects on education and the education systems. At least that part of the world where I am. In the public schools, there are huge differences in the capabilities of the schools to cope with, the online teaching, and there is a huge differentiation in access to technology that would make it possible for the online teaching and the skills of the teachers. So I think this had a really long-lasting effect on education and on the future of the kids in the schools. And the last thing that I would like to mention is the effect, I would say, a sort of a combined generational effects of these two crises. So there has been a generation coming out to the labor market, something like 15 years ago, who received a very massive shock twice, one after the other. So first the 2007-2008 crisis, and then the COVID crisis, and knowing the shape of the age earnings profiles of the various generations, I'm quite sure that there has been a long-term scarring effect on the prospects of the younger generations. And I think this would be the most important and the most long-lasting effect, not to speak about their trust in politics and trust in institutions, because the various governments were differed very much in their abilities to cope with the situation.
It's very interesting what you're saying, and obviously now I would like to understand better the effect of all this in the United States, and I have some follow-up questions as well to Indy afterwards, because it links to some of the stuff he said before.
So I think a lot of the phenomena that István described in Europe are quite similar in the United States. And I should clarify that it's not that technology and automation and computerization, et cetera, have had no effect on rising income inequality. It's more that the effect is smaller than the issues I raised of worker power related to labor market institutions like unions and the minimum wage in particular. Because in the United States, the minimum wage set at the national level is effectively binding in some of the states with the lowest incomes who refuse to set higher minimum wages on their own, and often even block localities within their jurisdictions from raising the minimum wage. And of course, we know unions can not only increase the quote unquote market income of workers, but also advocate for the sorts of tax and transfer policies that could also raise the disposable income of working class and more middle income workers in the United States and elsewhere. So we should acknowledge that there's also an issue, at least in the United States, of offshoring of a lot of jobs. I think that has slowed and in some cases appears to be reversing due to some recent investments the United States has made in domestic manufacturing, where it has become particularly profitable for some employers to shift production elsewhere. But now, with concerns about supply chains, especially amidst the pandemic and the war against Ukraine by Russia, there has been growing investment in domestic employment. And similarly, for the purposes of addressing the climate crisis, there will be some shift toward renewable energy that will certainly create jobs domestically. And there has been some effort by the Biden administration to ensure that those jobs will be decent jobs. The U.S. has a large share of low-paid jobs.
Can I interrupt you here? Because that was one of my question and remarks. It's great that you are just saying what's going on at the moment. It seems that with the current crisis and the disruption of the traditional global value chains, there is an inshoring rather than an offshoring of industries and manufacturing in the United States.
That's right.
And it seems that because the main factor that costs a lot of money at the moment is energy rather than job. Like energy is costing so much more than it used to cost that actually reshoring things are because of the situation of the energy production within the United States is not as bad as, for instance, we have in Europe. You have a situation where it's more convenient, even if labor is not decreasing in price, basically to bring back competitiveness in this. So my question to you is, yeah, it's true that we are seeing a reshoring of manufacturing, but due to two factors, which is one, automation, two, the overall situation, is that really going to decrease inequalities, or is actually just a factor that will increase manufacturing per se, industrial output, productivity, but not necessarily have an effect on the inequality issue?
That's a great question, Giuseppe. I think one way I think about this is the relative difference in power when you compare employers to workers. And the less employers have the ability to say, we will profit more by shifting the work to other countries, the more power the workers have domestically. So look, even in the United States, in the case of fossil fuel production, a lot of people don't appreciate the United States is, at any given moment, usually the world's largest oil producer. And we shifted to increase that production here because it was in the interest of companies involved in that and the national government. That means some more work has to happen here, and that can give some power to workers. So none of this is fait accompli. We have to see how the reshoring and investment in domestic supply chains plays out and be engaged to ensure that the jobs are good jobs. And that was one thing I just wanted to emphasize that I was saying earlier. Out of the 40 or so OECD countries for which we have measurements, the United States has maybe the 38th largest share of jobs that are low-paying jobs. So paying below a certain fraction of the median wage. So that is something that is quite different here than in much of Europe, where we have chosen to go a path of low-paying jobs. And when you have low pay, you typically have less flexibility fewer fringe benefits, as we call them, like health benefits and retirement benefits, and sometimes not even paid sick days, as we've seen with railroad workers who are about to go on strike or were going to be locked out by their employers in the United States recently because they couldn't even get a day off that was paid to see a doctor if they needed to. So the quality of jobs here, I want to note, especially at the lower end of the earnings distribution, is extremely poor.
Thank you. This is very interesting. And of course, I would like to throw the similar question, again, specular question to István about the situation in Europe. Because if we are seeing a reshoring of manufacturing in the United States with the current crisis, we've not seen it completely yet, but we are seeing now at the beginning of the winter the risk for recession in Europe and a risk of having the overall industrial apparatus that some of the most successful regions of the continent have based on, especially in Germany, I'm referring to, at stake. Like the industrial model is at stake, and are we at risk to see a wave of inequalities which we haven't seen it before, like unprecedented and different in nature?
Well, I think certainly yes, but I think reshoring and offshoring has a different meaning in Europe, if you consider Europe as a whole. Because, in Europe, there is the German economy who establishes car-making factories in Hungary and in Slovakia. And I don't know, in other European Union countries because of the internal differences in wages and taxation. And the French automaking companies are going to Romania and so on and so forth. And if there is a sort of a reshoring in that sense, then it will mean differential consequences for Germany and for the European peripheries, I would say, where they outsource their production. But let me make one comment about the trade unions. I mean, it's a very important thing. I mean, in Europe, there has been also a decline of trade unionism. And of course, in different level in the different countries, but there is a monotonous decline of that in the last, I would say, 30 years. I would like to emphasize one thing, that trade unions are always defending the insiders. So there are insiders and outsiders in the labor market. So trade unions are mostly defending those who are in the labor market, sometimes against those who would like to enter the labor market, whether they are coming from abroad or from the lower segments of the income distribution. So I think that for the level of the overall inequalities, it's very important that trade unionism and the rise of the unionization goes together with an increased involvement of the state, social policies to care for those who are outside the labor market and cannot really enter the labor force. And I see sometimes conflicts between these. But if there is a proper and wise government regulation for that, then there can be a good solution out of it. And some of the European countries produce this, good mix, and some of the European countries produce really bad mix, combining the bad elements.
Well, you just mentioned my next question, which would be which policy instrument would be best suited to address the challenges arising from inequalities. So that definitely what you were just suggesting is a possible way forward, or something that could be proposed in the European context. What else could be done, according to you, in Europe?
The first question is, which part of the income distribution are you worried about? If it's the top, or it's the middle, or if it's the bottom. In the European social policies, mostly focus on the bottom. So they are mostly in favor of extending the rights-based social assistance to those most vulnerable groups. But of course, it would be important to focus also on the middle, because the middle classes are the safeguards of the of the democracies in Europe. If you take a look at the election results in the last couple of years on both sides of the Atlantic, the largest worry is that the middle classes become more and more disillusioned and turn to those kinds of populist parties that might lead the policies into different undemocratic or less democratic directions. So I think these are both very important. And of course, especially in the US, where the rise of the very rich is considered to be a problem, then taxation also comes into the picture. But I would like to emphasize twice the policies of promoting social mobility in the various countries. That social mobility is important for both the lower segments and for the middle classes.
Is what we call the European social model, is it still something that we can look at as something that is at least sets of common standards we should aim at here in our continent?
It would be quite difficult to define what exactly the European social model is. There are the European social models in the various countries. And of course, at a very broad general level, there are shared values in the various countries, which can be considered to be a European social model as compared to, I don't know, the US or China or other countries. But if you go into the deep details, then you see very different policies in the various countries, which connect to each other at a very low level, I would say. So I think in general, yes, it's good to live in Europe. It's good to have this kind of model, which is in most cases, not everywhere, but in most cases is inclusive at least, and at least aims to be to build inclusive societies. But I think we are still very far of having a single European social model. Some of the analysts say that, fortunately, because if there would be a unified social model, then this wouldn't help us in experimenting, as what I mentioned at the beginning with the laboratories, social policies.
So from the European social model to whatever we can call the United States policy on inequalities, Indy, shed us some light about what do you think can be done in the current situation over there on the other side of the pond?
Well, Giuseppe, I think a lot depends on upcoming elections, but I will say that we have shown, at least on a temporary basis, some of what can be done. And more recently, we have made some permanent changes that at least move us in the right direction. And they're very similar in many ways to what István was describing is possible in Europe. Right now, we do have a president and administration in the White House who are trying to prioritize the power of workers. And I will say, István made a good point about making sure that people who are trying to enter the labor market and occupations have access and are not blocked out. And fortunately, I'd say in the United States, especially with the rise of a movement toward pre-apprenticeships, apprenticeships, and toward desegregating occupations, that many unions have come to be quite helpful and supportive in helping new people enter occupations that otherwise they may not have been able to. But we have raised taxes recently on corporations. And the corporate effective tax rate in the United States is quite modest compared to peer countries. And the Inflation Reduction Act did make some progress there. We have also made some investments in supports for families in reducing healthcare costs. So if we look at disposable income, healthcare costs in the United States consume a very large share of people's take-home income, I think probably unmatched in the world. And we are limiting that a bit further, partly by reducing the profits of pharmaceutical companies in the United States. And we have much more to do, especially when it comes to reducing inequality through making more permanent some of the changes in the American Rescue Plan, which was from 2 Januaries ago, the plan that President Biden proposed and then was later enacted to help stabilize and stimulate our economy. We created for the first time a child allowance, which unfortunately has not been renewed. And there are efforts right now to renew them. We also expanded wage supplements through what we call the Earned Income Tax Credit, which would be helpful. But we also have a particular problem with racial inequality and a racial wealth gap in the United States. A typical white household has about 8 times the wealth of a typical Black household in the United States. And this relates to things like segregation, discrimination in the housing market, certainly discrimination in the labor market, credit markets, and more. And things like the rough justice provided by the administration's student debt relief can actually help reduce racial wealth inequality. But there's much more that needs to happen going forward to make higher education in particular affordable in a way that it doesn't leave those who come from wealthier families with all the advantages and none of the risks or downside, while those who come from less wealthy families and often from families of color, as we would say, non-white families in the United States, are left with significant risks sometimes, where they also see less earnings in the labor market because of labor market discrimination and other issues. And they are saddled with this debt going forward. So that's an area where I think we could do a lot more. And finally, I should note that we have a huge challenge with gender equity, and in particular, allowing women to pursue careers as fully as men can. That's probably going to be significantly worse now with the Supreme Court's recent decision striking down access to reproductive health care and abortion for people who need them. And we do not provide national paid family and medical leave, which makes this quite unusual among wealthy countries. We are very far from providing affordable childcare for all. And we also have enormous challenges in helping families afford long-term care, home and community-based services, as we say, for aging loved ones and people with disabilities. These costs are so substantial, it makes no sense for every family to save for them, but we don't have a great program. We do some help there, but they really undermine people's labor market decisions, their ability to work. And then it certainly contributes to wealth inequality as well. But these are all areas where we could make progress.
Thank you so much. And of course, we could go on and discuss about these things for much longer, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this today. But we will keep this conversation alive within our series of podcasts and analysis dedicated to the Transatlantic Expert Group on the Future of Work. So thanks a lot, Indy and István.
Thank you very much for having us.
A great discussion, Giuseppe and István, and very much enjoyed it.
Thank you, and thanks to our listener. And I would like to remind everyone that you will find in the show notes the link to the project page of the Transatlantic Expert Group on the Future of Work. And as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot for joining The Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.